Natasha put together a really incredible outline along with a ton of resource links. There's a lot of good information there. Sent me the Western monarch count. And so you can actually volunteer to help count monarchs so we can keep track of the population and whatnot. It's very critical. It looks like we have a good group to start. We'll dive in, and thanks everybody for joining us. Take it away, Natasha.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to the Sloat Garden Center for inviting Xerces to come and speak today. A brief outline, just a brief introduction to Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, if you're not familiar with them. Introduce native pollinators and the benefits to our ecosystem, brief discussion of the European honeybee, and then how we can support pollinators and butterflies through habitat. A little bit about the Western monarch overview, and a bit about some commonly seen butterflies of the Bay Area. So thank you. So the Xerces Society, if you're not familiar, they've been around since 1971. They were founded by a lepidopterist who was studying global decline of moths and butterflies. And it was named after the little Xerces blue, which was endemic to the dunes of San Francisco and went extinct in about 1943 due to human impact. And it was the first known U.S. butterfly to go extinct due to human impacts to the dunes. And how do they do that? Xerces promotes conservation, advocacy, research, and a lot of education. And they have a lot of partners. They work around the world for 15 plus countries, scores of private foundations that provide funding, scientists in universities around the world, and they work with federal, state, and local agencies, farmers, both on public and private lands, and land managers. And they're very ethical about the companies that they that support them. And then, of course, there's a huge citizen science project programs through Xerces that you can join. And then, for all of us who garden and want to provide habitat for all invertebrates, thank you so much. So why care about pollinators? They provide ecosystem services, and it's defined as the benefits to human welfare provided by organisms interacting in ecosystems. And that's plant reproduction, food production, and they themselves are food for others. So a little overview of brief pollination 101. So pollen is the transfer of pollen grains from the stamen or the anther of a flower to the female, the pistil, the stigma. And approximately 15% of flowering plants are wind pollinated, grasses being an example, and the remaining 85% are reliant on insects as the primary pollinators, followed by birds and bats. So 85% of these flowering plants require reproduction. In the temperate areas of the world, bees are the most important pollinators. So in our area of the world, for plants of all kinds. Then you have flies are the most important at high elevation and high latitude regions, beetles in tropical and equatorial areas and rainforests. Butterflies and moths are considered incidental pollinators because as they nectar, they move pollen grains around, and they can carry pollen grains on their legs and undersides of their bodies. In fact, Lepidoptera is a Greek word for scaly wing, just like this little skipper moth. For us and everything, life on this planet, really, food production. So 1 to 3 bites or mouthfuls of food and drink we consume require pollinators, and they represent over 30 billion to the ag industry. So this was an interesting study that Whole Foods did. They wanted to show their customers what happens if you lose pollinators. So here's an aerial view of a standard produce department with pollinators. And here's a standard produce department without pollinators when you lose them. The staff took out 237 of 453 products, a total of 52% of the produce items normally sold in the store. And those included apples, avocados, eggplants, squash, and many others. A couple years later, they did it also in the dairy case. Because dairy is affected by cow feed, namely alfalfa. It requires pollination. In fact, there's some alfalfa that requires uses something called the alfalfa bee. So here it is without pollinators. You also lose a huge amount. And finally, and probably just as importantly, they support other wildlife. For fish, many species of fish rely on insects for food. Birds, fruits, and seeds make up the majority of many bird diets. Roughly 96% of terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects and other arthropods. Many of you have probably seen the Doug Tallamy presentation and his study of the Carolina chickadee, which as an adult eats a lot of seeds and are regular visitors to backyard bird feeders. Insects are the primary food for rearing its young, and a single pair may bring between 390 and 500 or so caterpillars to their nest each day. The nestlings will be in the nest for 16 to 18 days. So the parents may bring up to 10,000 caterpillars to fledge their brood, and they continue to support them after they fledge with caterpillars. It's a really high quality, dense protein. Even bears, grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park eat up to 40,000 Miller moths a day. A single moth has as much as a half a calorie. That means that 20,000 calories of just moths per day can be consumed by a rock-turning grizzly bear. You know, in a cultural perspective, plants and foods define much of our seasons and our holidays, provided by pollinators. So a little bit about pollinator diversity. These are the main groups of pollinators. There are butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and bees. I'm going to focus mostly on our native bees. And bees are the most important because they exhibit distinct behaviors. With the exception of a few species of wasps, only bees deliberately gather pollen to bring back to their nests for their offspring. Bees also exhibit a behavior called flower constancy, meaning that they repeatedly visit one particular plant on any species or species on any given foraging trip, and they tend to forage close to the nest. So they'll go to a patch of one flower and they will very consistently pollinate across, they'll nectar and pollen across those species and do a very efficient job of pollinating. In a single trip, a female bee may visit hundreds of flowers. In contrast, butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, and beetles visit flowers to feed on nectar for food or on the flower itself, in the case of some beetles, not to collect pollen. Thus, they come in contact less frequently with the flower anthers than bees do. So what are the ways that bees transport pollen? There are basically two. In the left here, there's a bumblebee with a corbicula, which is a little pollen basket on the rear of their legs, or they carry it on dry hair or a pollen brush, a scopa, dry hairs on the rear of their legs or the underside of the abdomen or the rear of the thorax. You know, honeybees are not typical bees. Most of you may know the European honeybee is not native to the US. It is native to Europe and parts of Asia and Africa. It's found all over the world. Came to the US with the colonists in the 1600s, but for honey and wax. But it wasn't really until the 20th century that they were actively raised for the benefits to agriculture, for pollination services. And unlike most of our native bees, which are solitary, honeybees are social. They live in large colonies. They can have up to 50,000 individuals in a hive. Almost all our native bees, except for bumblebees, are solitary, and honeybees are the only ones that create an excess of honey. Bumblebees can produce just enough to keep the colony alive when the weather's bad, to keep them alive for a few days. They're hugely important to the ag industry and to our food systems. And, you know, they are facing their own threats, principally also loss of habitat, disease, pests, insecticides, which causes poor nutrition, makes their immune systems not so great. And they're affected by, the industry is affected by honey prices, very sort of varying degrees of honey prices. But they're not endangered. There are estimated 2.9 million hives at any time in the US. They're considered managed livestock, although they've escaped, colonies have escaped into the wild. So a little bit about morphology, how to distinguish a bee versus a wasp and a bee versus a fly. This is pretty straightforward, but bees are hairier. They carry and they have a pollen carrying structure. Wasps, they have very narrow, the cinched waist. They tend not to be very hairy. They have these wings that they may fold lengthwise along their body. Bees versus fly can be a little more challenging unless you know the primary distinguishing characteristics. For the bee on the left has these long elbowed antennae. They have eyes on both sides of the head, and they have pollen-carrying structures and 2 pairs of wings, which can be really hard to determine unless you see them actually flying or they're buzzing, vibrating. The fly, this fly can almost look like a bee. It has a little bit of the hairiness here. It's got a striped body, but they have very small antenna. And the eyes, the compound eyes cover almost the whole front of the head. And, really they have no pollen carrying structure. That's probably another really distinguishing characteristic. They have 1 pair of wings too, which also can be rather difficult to determine. So what about our native bees? 90% of them are solitary. They are very gentle because they're not protecting a nest or a stash of honey. They don't typically sting unless provoked. Only social bees, such as honeybees and bumblebees, which live in colonies, are likely to sting in defense of their nest if disturbed. And worldwide, there are an estimated 20,000 species of bees, with approximately 3,600 native to the USA and Canada. And California alone has 1,600 species of native bees. There's a huge diversity. This picture, and they're both the largest and smallest bee are in California. So right here, this large bee is the valley carpenter bee, the Xylocopa varipuncta. Can be up to 1.25 inches long, and on top of it sits here the little Perdita minima, the little lost bee. And this bee is so small it can turn around comfortably inside a lowercase o in a standard font. They come in a wide range of colors, from dull black to metallic, green or blue. They may have markings in red, orange, white, black, brown, or yellow. And some don't actually look like bees. This is a little cuckoo bee. It's not very hairy. It's hard to distinguish the pollen structure. It has a long antenna. And just for size or scale, this is a dime. They also have a whole set of eyes. They have 2 large compound eyes on either sides of the head. This is actually a nocturnal tropical bee. And then they have these 3 little eyes on top of their head. It's so they can see the light spectrum plus UV colors, although red doesn't show up well for some species. And it's something to consider when you're planting flowers, although butterflies and birds tend to be attracted to red flowers. They also have varying tongue lengths. The length of a tongue of this bumblebee allows it to reach, nectar deep inside the flowers. Some bees with short tongues can only reach the nectar of shallow flowers. And there are bees that practice something called nectar robbing. You may have heard of this, such as a California carpenter bee, the Xylocopa californica. When my manzanita blooms in the spring, it has a little urn-shaped flower, and I'll find little holes at the base of the flower where I have a lot of carpenter bees. The carpenter bees can't get their tongues into the flower, so they rob nectar from the side. A little bit of the natural history of bees, solitary bees and bumblebee life cycles, nesting, and food. So this is a solitary bee life cycle. It's basically up to a year. 90% of our native bees are solitary. Most of the native bees live for about a year. The adult stage typically lasts about 3 to 4 weeks. The offspring typically remain in the nest for about 11 months, growing through the egg, larva, and pupa stages. So when when the female arrives in the spring, she mates, she digs these holes. If it's a ground nesting bee, deposits a little pollen sac here, lays an egg, the little larva comes out, eats the egg, and then develops into the pupa stage, which looks pretty much like the adult, and then overwinters there basically for another 8 to 9 months, and then the cycle starts all over again. And what do these solitary bees need? Roughly 70% are ground nesting. So it can sometimes resemble ant nests. They may be found in turf, more often on bare, exposed ground. Sandy to loam soils are preferred, but some will nest in clay too. And you look for them on south-facing sunny slopes. And they create these kind of branched tunnels where they'll lay 1 and up to 3 or 4 eggs per tunnel and cap them off. The other roughly 30% of native bees are tunnel nesting bees, and that can be in a snag, wood tunnels, usually hollow stems, or the abandoned beetle borer holes found in dead trees or stumps. And on this little drawing right here shows a leafcutter bee. They create these little individual sacs or areas where they deposit the eggs, and then they cap it with mud or debris. And here is, this was also, let's see, this was the orchard. Oh, sorry, this is leafcutter bee, and this is the orchard bee down below, creating similar sections that they then cap off. And they need nest materials. They collect leaf pieces, resin, soil, mud, petals, fine pebbles, sawdust, or trees resin. Damp ground or mud puddles and a variety of native plants near the nest will be important for construction material. And that also will benefit butterflies that drink from puddles. Beetle-riddled snags should be left for mason and leafcutter bees. Maintaining existing plants or grow additional plants to provide nesting habitat for bees. And plants with stems that bees utilize as tunnel nests are really helpful. Things like box elder, sunflowers, wild roses, raspberry, blackberry, elderberry, buckwheats, snowberry. Good plants for nesting bees. So the bumblebee life cycle is similar. It's a year long, basically. But bumblebees live in what they call colonies, and they can have up to 500 individuals. They're also ground nesters. Their colonies are annual, not perennial, like honeybees, European honeybees. So the queen creates the first few brood cells from wax and then provisions them with pollen and nectar and lays her eggs. So here she's doing that in here. It will take 4 to 5 weeks for the first egg she lays to emerge as adult bees. And these bees become workers, and she can determine that, just like the honeybee. She can determine whether it's a worker or a queen or a drone. Depending on the role in the nest, the workers may live for 1 to 2 months, by which time there will be more workers to replace them. The queen will continue to lay eggs, and the colony will grow steadily through the summer. And at the end of the summer, new queens and drones will emerge and mate. Because bumblebees have an annual life cycle and generally only occupy nest sites for 1 year, a repeated use of the same nest site would happen only by chance, as overwintering queens do not spend the winter in the nest they were born. Because of that, we encourage people to find nest sites near their home to try to make space for the bumblebees during the season rather than attempt to move or exterminate them. So what do they need? Bumblebees nest in existing cavities such as old rodent holes or the base of bunch grasses. So if you don't tidy all areas, have long grass and overgrown places, they can provide winter shelter for butterflies as well. Of course, they need flowers. They drink nectar from any accessible flower. They're generalists for the most part. But some bees, because of tongue length or certain habits, will spend more time on a particular species. What are the threats? Well, primarily it's habitat loss. And, of all the activities that humans do, agriculture over time has probably contributed to the most habitat loss simply by the amount of acreage required over and above even development. Well, the one component of habitat loss is conversion, development intensive agriculture, landscaping that's not pollinator friendly. And another part is pesticide contamination of areas that would otherwise be pollinator habitat. And a third factor in habitat loss is declines of key plant species that pollinators depend on, like milkweed that monarchs need to reproduce. And that habitat loss can include the monoculture landscaping, no biodiversity, or heavy mulching of areas which are devoid of plant nectar and habitat, and also sort of smother the ground and don't allow some of these soil nesting bees to live out their lifestyle cycle. Of course, pesticide. And pesticide is an umbrella term including insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, as well as rodenticides and even antimicrobial products. But the term is often misused as synonymous with insecticides. It's much broader. The pesticides that we're most concerned about for pollinators are insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. And this was, I don't know if any of you remember, in 2013, there was a 50,000 bumblebee die-off in Portland, Oregon. And there were linden trees that were sprayed at flowering, and there were all these bumblebees feeding on them. And they used a neonicotinoid. I don't remember which specific pesticide it was, but the estimate was 50,000 bees killed at that time. But what they did later, they did a study later, and they realized it was much broader than that, because as a neonicotinoid, even if it doesn't kill the bee right away, it's systemic, and they take it back to the nest and it ends up killing the whole colony. So the estimate now is more like 100,000 bees that were killed in that one application. It was just a mistake. People didn't know, but it was a big wake-up call. And then, of course, we use pesticides in urban environment, largely cosmetic. And one of the problems with urban pesticide use is it's not particularly regulated, and it's most often overused. Of course, our third big factor now is climate change, loss of biodiversity, loss of habitat, changing timing between when things are available for food to insects, and then up the food chain. So how do we combat this? How do we help in this help to conserve these areas and protect and expand pollinator habitat? It's providing habitat. Support the entire life cycle. Bees need secure nest sites, flowers for foraging, and a pesticide-free environment. And bee nesting sites, it's very helpful if in your garden you can retain a natural existing snags, shrubs with hollow stems, and bare ground. And this doesn't have to be a big area. You can have a pretty small yard and just provide a little bit at the base of a rock, or at the base of various shrubs, at the base of bunch grasses. You can build nest blocks. I've never had a whole lot of luck with these, but many people do. It's really good to put them in a sunny, south-facing area. Tunnel nests seem to work. It'd be interesting to hear if people have had good experience with them. And the program now that Xerces really focuses on this time of year is Leave the Leaves. And this is overwintering for a host of insects, even if, the ground decomposers that maintain our soils. But for pollinators, it's a variety of things you can do. You don't have to take up all the leaves or leave all the leaves. Leave a thin layer, leave it on grassy areas. This can provide nutrients and mulch. Spread on vegetable or flower beds for soil building and weed suppression. You pile around the base of trees, shrubs, and perennials. And avoid shredding the leaves. I was using a little electric mulcher until I realized I was probably mulching caterpillars and the adults. And it's kind of challenging. This can be kind of challenging for us gardeners. We're sort of programmed to clean up in the fall and make things tidy and neat. And oftentimes we're denying those important insects overwintering habitat. In many ways you can do this. You can save the stems. They've got plants with pithy stems that you cut back at varying lengths. You can build a stick pile or leave a little pile of sticks. When you're pruning, leave a little pile of sticks. Insects will occupy the cut end of hollow sticks and caddies in between. You can build a rock pile, which can include, a wall, a retaining wall. It can be part of your hardscaping, incorporate bunch grasses, shrubs, or flowers around the pile to increase wildlife value. And forage patches. Plants bloom everywhere, but not all flowers will help bees and butterflies. You want to retain existing flower patches in your yard, create new patches, and ideally locally plants are better as they've evolved with both native pollinators. Here's a little selection of buckwheat and Clarkia. And the buckwheat lasts longer. This is in terms of a length of time for flowering plants. Ideally, you want something from spring through late fall, early winter. Buckwheat, for me, starts early spring and goes all the way through till this time of year almost. And Clarkia, of course, is mostly spring, early to mid spring and summer. And you want to provide a choice of plants. Bees don't see red, so white, yellow, purple are great. They see ultraviolet, and green is the same as red to them. Diversity of flowers is good for diversity of bees. 3 species of flower blooming at all times from late winter to late fall is kind of ideal. But again, any plant, any amount of plant is very helpful. And bees, pollinators are going to fly, and they're going to take a long overhead look at the whole environment and move from property to property. Native plants have shown to support a greater diversity and abundance of native bees. With climate change, drought tolerant is important. Some of the xeriscaping, some of the Mediterranean plants are just as good. And within a landscape context, smaller spaces can still make a difference. Think about the habitat around you, even local parks. Can you fill in blooming gaps? If you were bee flying around, what would you need? And native is best, again, because they've evolved with a lot of these native plants if you want to attract native pollinators. But garden plants, a lot of our horticultural landscape plants are fine. You have echinacea, asters, coreopsis, sunflowers, zinnias, lavender, rosemary. Try and buy true species or heirloom varieties. Unfortunately, what happens with genetics and creating varieties and cultivars is they often lose their ability to produce pollen and nectar. And for some reason, double flowered varieties seem to have lost both. Lawns, you don't have to get rid of your lawn, just maybe reduce the size. And there are native turf grasses that are available. Allow clover, dandelions to remain, apply benign neglect. Of course, if you do need to use pesticides, make sure you're really reading the application and when to apply particularly. But unfortunately, even when label instructions are followed, there is a limited protection for native bees. And if you have a really biodiverse yard, you're going to attract a lot of beneficial predators and parasitoids. So it will reduce the amount of pesticide application, hopefully, you need or would want to use. So moving to Western monarchs, which are starting to collect for overwintering in the groves along the coast. The Western population breeds in Western states and into Canada, but not in the maritime Northwest. And this area, because historically there's been no milkweed in this blue area, they they overwinter along the coast. Originally, they probably were all the way up to the border of Oregon, but they think that we've lost these overwintering sites or they can't be found. So sort of from Mendocino down to Baja is where they overwinter. And during the summer, they breed in mostly the western states. Some will go back down to Mexico. And then you have the whole eastern side of the country that primarily moves up from Mexico and breeds all around the eastern United States and then goes back. And the threats to overwintering sites on the West Coast, well, in Mexico as well, it's logging. Originally, it was logging for wood. Unfortunately, now it's also clearing for avocado orchards. And of course, climate change. If avocados concern you, one way to combat that is to only buy avocados from California. Unfortunately, it's not as long a season. It's April to September, but it's something to consider. And in California, it's development, neglect of groves, and eucalyptus groves are aging out. Of course, there's threats to breeding habitat. Milkweeds are the primary food for caterpillars, and milkweed has been lost from the landscape, primarily from herbicide, habitat conversion and herbicides on farms. And insecticide contamination, non-native milkweed growing in gardens, and that's typically the tropical milkweed. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And, with the loss of habitat is what they need to nectar, flowers that they need to nectar on. So this is kind of the history, recent history of the populations in California overwintering. In 2021, we hit a real low point. This was about 2,000 butterflies were counted and they were considered functionally extinct. And then the next year they rebounded to 248,000. In the 22-23, I think it was just about 10,000 less. So we'll see what happens this year. Hopefully it holds steady. Same thing is happening in Mexico, 35% more forest well, covers 35% more forest, but they're losing forest pretty quickly, hectares. They're losing hectares each year. But the overall population in the Western is down since the 1980s by 95%, and the Eastern 70% decline. And what they need is same as other pollinators. They need habitat primarily. They need nectar plants for adults. They need the milkweed for caterpillars, shelter and hanging spaces for chrysalis. You know, the Xerces Pollinator Protection Pledge is plant pollinator-friendly flowers, provide nesting, protection from pesticides, and to share the word. Put up a sign. You can get signs from multiple agencies that shows your wildlife habitat. Avoid pesticides as well. And adults feed on nectar 2 to 5 weeks for breeding generation. 6 to 8 months for the overwintering generation. There's typically two Western generations, you know, the ones who come in, who leave the overwintering sites and have breed in the spring. They die off, but then they leave the overwintering population. So there's two generations during the year. And you know, they need milkweed. And in the areas where we live on the coast or in the Bay Area, well, actually, I should say Bay Area, it's typically the Asclepias fascicularum, the narrow leaf milkweed, but you can also plant the showy, and the showy is quite spectacular. I've had more luck with monarch eggs on the narrow leaf. So on the left here are the Western species of, there are actually a lot of them. Here's some primary Western species. This is the Eastern, so I won't cover that. This is the fascicularis, the narrowleaf. To the left up here, this is the showy, and this is the woolly pod, and these are more central and eastern sides of the state. And this is what's called the antelope horn. So a little bit about tropical milkweed. It's very pretty, and the problem with it is it blooms all year long, and so the monarchs will stop migrating. And the problem with that is the foliage can carry something called a virus called, or a parasite actually, called OE. It's Ophiocystis electrocera. Ophiocystis electrocera. Say that a few times. And what happens is it's OE is transferred from the butterfly to plant, and plant to caterpillar, and caterpillar to chrysalis to adult, and back to the plant. So it's an endless cycle. But you can, you know, if you have tropical milkweed, just cut it down during the winter and let it come back in the spring. Cut it down fall and winter when the monarchs are going to be overwintering. And even if a lot of people don't want to cut it down because there's caterpillars, but the problem with that is the caterpillars will keep that cycle going, and often the development of the caterpillar is deformed, so they don't make it as adults. So a little bit about butterflies of the Bay Area. This is a big topic, and I'm only going to just cover a few that you can see pretty often and have fairly easy to grow host plants. So the pipevine swallowtail, Batis phalenar, the host plant is the California pipevine, Aristolochia californica. Can be a little challenging to get started, but once you've got it, it's a sprawling big vine with spectacular flowers. And the butterfly is pretty common around here. I've seen it from early winter, February, March, all the way through the end of summer. And a swallowtail is often pretty common, and it's nice because it feeds on many species of Apiaceae. So everything from your ornamentals, your edible plants, your parsley, your fennel, coriander, to its native species, the native Apiaceae, Apiaceae native to California. Northern checker spot also has a variety of host plants: goldenrod, asters, rabbit brush. And the umber skipper, or most of the skippers, actually, the host plant are various grasses and sedges. So if you are a bunch grass, native bunch grass, you'll have lots of skippers. And you also provide habitat for nesting bumblebees. So just you know, the campaigns that Xerces puts out to bring back the pollinators, you can get a lot of information on their website. grow pollinator-friendly flowers, provide nest and egg-laying sites, avoid using pesticides, share the word. They have other programs called things like Bee City USA, where they work with a city or municipality to provide habitat and reduce pesticide use in cities. They have a wonderful X-Kids program. This is a pamphlet targeted to grades 3 and 5, and it's in English and Spanish. It's a wonderful program for kids as they move through all the information to get little you can get stickers and all sorts of things that kind of keep you going, you know, on this path of learning about invertebrates. There's a lot of community science, Bumblebee Watch, Bumblebee Atlas, Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, and there's also the Western Monarch count. They have lots of books. Go to the website. They have tons of information you can download. And a really fun thing, they monthly put out a bug banter, and it covers insects all across the nation. It's not just California, but it's really enlightening. They're 45 minutes to an hour, really fun. Check out their media, you know, their social media, their YouTube channel. Of course, they would love donations if you feel so inclined. And just wanted to thank you for your time, and happy to answer any questions.
Oh, wow. That was incredible. Huh, Dan?
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. That was
Thank you.
You're welcome.
we do have a couple of questions that have popped up here. One is recommendations for native plants that will do well in outdoor pots.
Oh, you know who has a whole program with that is, oh boy, if I can, the nursery in Oakland, East Bay, is it East Bay Wilds? I think
Yes.
it's called East Bay Wild. He has a whole native potted program. I would suggest going to their website or going to that nursery, and it's somewhere in Oakland. I'm sorry, I can't actually remember where it is. But that's what I'd recommend. The other thing is CalScape, which is the California Native Plant Society, the state website, which is a fabulous resource. You can put in your address and it comes up with all the plants native to your area. And it often talks about horticulture, so it may mention that they're good in, you know, they'll be fine in pots. And your nurseries, Sloat Garden Center, I'm sure, can help you with that as well.
Well, we have a lot of experience with growing things in pots, and they don't always sell immediately, so we keep them going a long time sometimes. But your basic things that we've been talking about today, milkweeds do fine in pots, ceanothus, manzanitas. Most California natives can be grown in pots as long as you don't keep them too soggy, and you give most of them plenty of sun. And you can also check out the program that I did a couple weeks ago on the Sloat website or our YouTube page about starting California natives from seed and grow lots of our annual and perennial wildflowers from seed very successfully in containers. If you have a small garden or a deck, you can have your own little patch of pollinator-friendly plants.
Yeah, and I just want to say that a big takeaway, and we were talking about this before, is that I'm glad that whoever asked that is just thinking about what they can do to help pollinators in a small space, because even just adding one plant is going to help. So it's not like you have to dive in and have acres or whatever. It's what you can do just even on a small deck. That's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, and I did want to mention one thing. So this often comes up about monarchs and milkweed. So historically, milkweed was not found grown within, or didn't grow within 5 miles of the coast. So this is something to be aware of. If you are within 5 miles of the coast, Xerces recommends not planting milkweed because, again, it's going to stop the monarchs from migrating. But certainly nectar plants, they need food.
Yeah, Sloat can't sell it in some of our stores that are closer to the coast for that reason. So thanks for bringing that up. And then a couple of things that I learned, I was gonna say, was You said the term incidental pollinators, which I thought was really cool. I hadn't heard that term before. Um, so it's just kind of fun that they're pretty and they're flitting around and they're also helping everything out too.
Yeah, and butterflies actually are very important to certain species of plants too. That they're most effective pollinators for those. Offhand, I can't tell you exactly what those would be in California, but studies are showing that they actually do more than was originally thought by the incidental pollination.
Yeah, that and then 1 in 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator. That's incredible.
And the other
Gosh.
that I didn't mention about bumblebees. Bumblebees do something called buzz pollination, which honeybees don't do, and most other bees don't do. And bumblebees are actually responsible for pollinating most of the nightshade family. So your tomatoes, your peppers, your your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplants. They also will pollinate things like, I think it's kiwi, and there's a couple other fruits. And in commercial nurseries that grow or tomatoes in a hothouse situation, they actually use bumblebees. They put bumblebees inside there.
That's
Uh,
awesome.
Natasha, is there a conflict between the concept of leaving the leaves in place and the idea of needing some bare ground for the ground-dwelling bees to make their nests? Or can they find their way through the leaves just fine?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's again this sort of balancing act in between leaving a little bit of bare ground. You don't need to leave a lot and leaves, but you can also sort of confine them to around you confine leaves to around the base of plants without, going too close to the trunk. And then leave a little bare ground on the other side of it, on the other side of that mulching, or do it at the base of, leave the base of bunch grasses or grasses or excuse me, or rocks available. And again, it doesn't have to be a lot, actually.
Mhm.
A bare
So
ground.
when you're okay, that made me think of something too. So when you're leaving, we were talking about like the stalks of sunflowers or whatnot for the bees. How
Mhm.
long do you leave them through the winter and prune them in like February or something, or how long do you let them?
Yeah, so the bees are going to merge in early spring for the most part. They'll merge in early spring. So if you can leave them that long, that's ideal. The other thing is most of those perennials, the leaves will cover them. They'll grow up when they start to come out again, the deciduous perennial plants, they'll cover it. And then in the summer, if you really don't like them, just pull them out.
Mhm.
Yeah. But it can be, it's a challenge with, especially with California native plants, when if you have a mostly native yard, it tends not to look very good in the late summer and fall. So that tendency to want to clean it up is pretty strong for most of us. And we want these yards to be attractive. We want people to plant natives. For a variety of reasons. So it's that balance between keeping that yard looking attractive enough that people are willing to plant natives and also providing this habitat for all sorts of insects.
I think I've mentioned this before, but I have a friend who lives in Santa Rosa with a garden that is fruit trees and roses, which probably agriculturally are the most heavily sprayed things, that we grow. And they decided several years ago to just stop spraying. And it did take a transition of, I would say, 3 to 4 years or something. But what happened is what Natasha is saying is that this whole ecosystem started emerging where you have predator insects and, it's a balance. It takes care of itself. So I think in the nursery, people come in all the time worried about, a hole in a leaf or, a spot on a leaf or whatever. And really, it's all part, it ends up balancing out if we don't go spraying a bunch of stuff and freaking out about it, you know? It's part of
Yeah.
nature.
You're
Yeah.
disrupting that beneficial cycle too. Then you have even more need for, often have more need for pesticides and insecticides and herbicides.
I have a question here from Steve who asks, I guess this is kind of for Jen and me, maybe, what kind of potting soil to use for growing natives in containers. The main thing is most natives don't like a super fertile soil. So if you use a soil that has a lot of additive, a potting soil that says on the bag it has a lot of bat guano and other fertilizer type elements, don't add fertilizer to it. Just use it straight out of the bag. And if you have a potting soil that's mostly ingredients like bark and peat moss and sand and rock, then do add a little bit of a balanced fertilizer to it, just so that you have some balanced nutrition in there. It should drain well, but most engineered potting soils do drain well, and that's not usually a problem. So any good quality potting soil will work fine for natives, just as they do for almost all plants.
Yeah, slope potting soil. Use that. I've used it several times for native. A lot of good information. Had about 8 chrysalises this season that turned brown, and the monarchs never emerged.
I noticed tiny holes.
Oh, they were probably parasitoid. They there are parasitic wasps that can affect both the caterpillar and the chrysalis. Might have been hard to say. Where were they? Where were the chrysalis? Were they on?
Doesn't say.
Yeah.
This is a typed question, but yeah, one of the ironies, of course, of life is that we consider the parasitic wasps to be good insects in that they parasitize a lot of the insects that humans consider bad insects, but they also parasitize the ones that we consider charismatic, like the butterflies that we love, and that's part of life. They are going to do that job, but you have to look at it as I have a balanced ecosystem going on there if I have some wasps in my environment that are eating even if they're eating my monarch caterpillars.
Yeah, because everything is food for something else. You know, those wasps are food for something else. So it's that cycle. Just best to have a nice balanced ecosystem if you can.
Right. It's not a failure. It's not a failure on your part at all. It's a sign of a balanced ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Get out and have some quality garden time.
Yeah, look for those insects. Get a macro
Right.
lens for your iPhone. Photograph them.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much, Natasha and Dan. It was great to have you join too, and a lot of information there that we'll be talking about going forward. So I really appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.